Welcome, and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are on a listen-only mode. This call is also being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. During the Q&A session, please press star 1 on your touch-tone phone if you would like to ask a question. You will be prompted to record your first and last name. I will now turn the call over to Ms. Margaret Farrell. You may begin.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much, and welcome everyone to the January Advanced Topics in Implementation Science webinar. I can't think of a better way to start a new calendar year of programming than with two of our charter presenters, Dr. David Chambers and Enola Proctor. Before turning today's session over to them, I just want to run through a couple of quick logistics and then introduce our speakers. As the operator said, questions are encouraged, and there are two ways you can ask your questions. You can press star 1 to ask your question on the phone live, and you will be connected at the end of the call to the queue directly with the speaker, or you can type your question in the Q&A tab at the top of your screen. You hit Ask to submit the question after you finish typing. We're fortunate in that the D&I webinar series garners a great deal of interaction between the speakers and the audience, and we hope today will spark a high level of engagement as well. And it's a real joy to introduce today's speakers. Dr. David Chambers is Chief of the Services Research and Clinical Epidemiology Branch of the Division of Sciences and Intervention Research at the National Institute of Mental Health. He arrived there in 2001, and he continues to manage a portfolio of grants that studies the integration of scientific findings and effective clinical practices in mental health within real-world service settings. Since 2006, David has also served as Associate Director for Dissemination and Implementation Research, leading NIH initiatives around the coordination of dissemination and implementation research in health. Dr. Enola Proctor is nationally recognized for her work in advancing the implementation of evidence-based practices in social service settings as well. Dr. Proctor is a pioneer in the field of mental health services research, and for more than a decade, she has led the Brown School Center for Mental Health Services Research. The center collaborates with its national network of research partners to build a base of evidence designed to address the challenges of delivering mental health services to vulnerable populations. They've both presented on the Advanced Topics webinar before, and we're very happy that they've returned for another round. We invited them to offer their summary of and reflection of the recent NIH meeting on dissemination and implementation research, working meeting on research training. So with no further ado, David and Enola, I turn it over to you, and welcome. Thanks again. David, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks very much. So I'm going to advance a couple slides here. You can see our lovely pictures. We're both, even though these were both taken at different times in different cities, we're both apparently looking at the exact same thing. So well done us. It was nicely, there's something off to, I think, the left.
Right. The bright future of implementation training.
It is a road that we are all going to travel. Before we go on, I do want to thank both Sarah and Margaret here at NCI for helping to make this happen. It's been nice to be able to show up and have this ready to go, given the chaos that often pops into every day. So thanks to you. And I really also want to thank Enola for generously giving so much of her time. I'm going to give you, on my part, a little bit of broader context for this meeting and a couple other meetings that one you've already heard about in a previous webinar and one you'll hear about in the coming months. And then go into some of the discussions that we had at this particular two-day workshop. And ideally, I'll turn it over to Enola, and following that, we want to have as rich a discussion as possible. This is one of these areas training that's really going to take everyone's input, everyone's investment, and everyone's strategizing around how do we do better to build large field capacity for the workforce that we really want to carry dissemination and implementation research in the future. So it's thank you to specific people who made this possible, but also thank you to all of you for taking time to spend with us and hopefully engage in discussion that starts today and continues on for a while. So what I wanted to start with, as I move down, is a bit of the context for what have been 3 work group meetings. So many of you may know that we had a number of 5 large meetings that NIH did in conjunction with the VA and AHRQ at some points and several foundations, where we were really trying to develop a large forum, large capacity where people could come not only to share their findings about research that they were doing, but also really to try and grapple with some of the challenges of what we've seen as this rapidly growing but still emerging field. You'll see we were quite successful with these large meetings in attracting your interest, your investment, and your expertise. In a matter of years, we quadrupled the number of registrants. And we focused on a number of different themes over the years, including methods, including measurement, including building field capacity more generally, including the interface between policy and practice. And with the fifth one, we really saw ourselves at the crossroads, that we were trying to figure out, okay, we've established a fair amount of capacity, but there's still room to grow. At the same time, with each of these annual meetings, we had more opportunities to work with newer investigators to the community. We had these technical assistance workshops. After the fifth meeting, there's a group of us at NIH who get together every other month or so to really talk about how can we advance the research agenda. And the work group discussions went back and we talked a lot about those 5 meetings. And what we realized were that the themes were right on, but because we were focusing more on a large field opportunity, there wasn't as much movement within those meetings as to how we could tangibly advance methods, tangibly advance measurement, tangibly think about a training plan. And so what we recognized is there are tools and resources still needed, but what we thought about was whether some smaller targeted meetings might help us to get some work done. At the same time, there's been some logistical challenges around large meetings, and so this gave us a chance both to work through those and also to keep advancing the field. Yeah. And so what we thought about is, okay, we have these 3 different work group meetings, but there's a lot of reciprocal, I'm thinking I skipped over, let me just go. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So the 3 meetings that we had tried to pull together, the first one, which we're focusing on today, was around training. And the major question that we were thinking about is, beyond some of the really exciting individual programs that have prospered in recent years, how do we think more at the field level in terms of how we advance dissemination, implementation, research training? We had a second meeting that you've already heard about in a webinar, or some of you have, around measurement and standardized reporting, where we're really thinking about how do we build on advances that have happened to augment current measures, and how do we standardize reporting for the field so that there's much more consistent information coming out of a lot of the studies. And then we more recently had a rescheduled research designs meeting where we were really thinking about what resources can help the field determine, fit optimal design when you're thinking about attacking different questions, different phenomena, different contexts. You'll hear about that one, I believe, in March. What we recognized was that there were a lot of overlap among the different topics. So when we were thinking about training, we were very much focusing on what's going on in design and measurement that we really need to think about in training. Similarly, when they were focusing on methods, on reporting, on measurement, there was a sense of how do we train people up on these things, or how do we see the convergence between measures and methods. And so what you'll see on this next slide is just a couple of the questions where we really saw the interface among the groups. What you're hearing right now is going to be a report out of the second of the 3 meetings. You'll hear the third. And following that, we're very much interested in keeping the momentum going around how these 3 different groups and these 3 different efforts can converge. So specifically with the training meeting, I think where we certainly are is with a growing field. As I said before, we have NIH meetings in the past that have exceeded 1,200 registrants, or even 1,300 registrants. We have at NIH a program that we run with the VA and with many senior investigators in the field, where we've gotten 5, or it's the Training Institute on Dissemination and Implementation Research in Health. And basically we've got 5 or 10 applicants for every slot that we can hope to provide. We've also done a survey, and we've seen that there are a growing number of degree programs that are available, but they're still relatively few. You may be able to count them on a single hand, or perhaps 2. So it's a growing field where there isn't necessarily yet the capacity to respond to it. On this call, just looking from who's currently at least showing up in the box, and certainly in the audience and participating in these different meetings, has been a lot of expertise, a lot of understanding that we're trying to draw on, a lot of local innovation, those of you who have experienced training either as a faculty member or actually as a trainee, we want to learn from your experience and really continue to find ways to scale up some of the local innovations. And really for our training meeting, the focus has been and will continue to be, how do we put this all together? So what I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of a rundown of the range of things that we uncovered through the training program. And certainly synthesis is what's on our mind. So there were three key questions that we set up. The first one, as I had said before, was what is this field-based training? And by field, I mean dissemination and implementation research community most broadly. What's the field-based vision for training investigators at multiple career stages to gain expertise in D&I research? We had a second question around, are there tools and resources that we can pull together to support this vision? So it's not limited to the number of slots that we may have across a number of programs. And then identifying, are there gaps? We didn't necessarily all come together and say, how does my program fit into this broader environment? So what gaps need to be filled? What are the places that we really haven't seen anything going on as we're thinking about the range of future D&I scientists? We were very much focused not on ending the proceedings with conversation, but rather with deliverables. And so we had brainstormed, and these are things that are in progress, but one of them that we were very interested in was, is there a way to at least pictorially map the different dissemination implementation training programs? And how might we contrast where we currently are, so mapping the current programs versus where do we ultimately want to be? We had this as an exercise at the meeting, and what we found actually was each person had a different mental map that they were putting together. So what you won't see today is the beautiful one that synthesized everyone's lesson. That is something that's in progress. But what we absolutely want to do is build toward just a better way of mapping all of the different opportunities that are out there. We're also focusing on a set of papers that are reflecting this sort of field-based vision. We're considering different topics for papers, and Ola and I are at the helm of several of them, and we're getting other folks who are involved, and even those of you on the phone may be involved in contributing to this. We're also thinking about, is there a mechanism for developing a clearinghouse of training approaches? Dealing with the intellectual property issues, is there a way that we can make more available as much of the content of trainings as possible? And then what we really want to do is continue to articulate what's missing. How can we bridge the gap for where we don't have adequate coverage? So in terms of the current landscape for D&I research training, we've seen and have run and organized and been to a number of summer training institutes. We've seen that there are now master's and PhD degree programs that are specializing around implementation science. We've seen standalone graduate courses, cores within the Clinical Translation and Science Awards, those large centers around translation that have been devoted to dissemination and implementation research, and in some cases serving as a service to investigators within the broader community. We've seen webinars, we're on one right now, and other online materials. There are activities that individual research centers have done. There's been the development of implementation research toolkits, certificates for folks to gain expertise. There's ongoing collaboratives to try and pull people together who have a shared interest in adding skills in dissemination implementation research. And there's been any number of mentoring activities. We were also interested in this meeting of not limiting it to what mechanisms were solely focused on dissemination implementation research. So at the meeting, we had a number of people who led other sorts of training enterprises. So again, beyond just D&I research, we've seen summer training institutes. We've seen the use of institutional training grants, but not necessarily specifically around dissemination and implementation research. We've certainly seen people use career development awards. We've seen people use informal apprenticeships where you find an expert who you're sort of training with. We've seen individual research fellowships that are both a general use, and several people have used them for dissemination and implementation research. And then we've seen a range of mentoring activities and clinical scholars programs. What we're interested in is identifying that maybe some of the gaps may already have mechanisms that can help us to fill them. And so what we really wanted to do is not only map the D&I training, but think about the broader research training enterprise and how do the two converge. Any number of a range of formats have been represented among the D&I research training activities. We've seen this sort of immersive week-long training institute. We've seen year-round institution-based training. We've seen these kind of ongoing courses that may have a fixed time period, either in person or on the web. We've seen standalone webinars and webinar series. We've seen a lot of one-on-one and group-based mentoring, and you can see these other courses and other opportunities. What we're seeing is that there's likely no single mechanism that's going to work if we want to train all of the diverse experts that we need for the field. But what we certainly want to do is learn from those formats that seem more successful and those that maybe haven't been as successful. We've also seen a number of methods of support. So several of these entities have been supported through the federal government, through health research funding agencies. We've actually seen methods of support coming from tuition and revenues from courses. So we're not only interested in how can we get things going, but we're certainly in this slide thinking about sustainability. Is there a business model for perpetuating the kind of training opportunities that we're trying to foster? We've seen foundation support training. We've seen training supported by the local institution, whether it's a university or other sort of organization. We've seen supplements of grants supplements to grants providing opportunities for training. We've seen standalone research grants that have as their mission to conduct this kind of a training. And then we've even seen that there were stipends from industry to gain expertise in D&I research. Again, it's the kind of thing where we probably need all of these, or we need some mix to be able to truly sustain the capacity building activities that we want. In terms of who's receiving the training, this was actually very interesting for us because when we had started out the particular idea for the two-day work group, I think primarily we were thinking about the training of researchers who were trying to enter the field or who were trying to advance in the field. And what was very clear was it wasn't just researchers who the people around the table were acknowledging needed to be the targets of the training. And so there were some really interesting models that were shared, in some cases internationally, where it wasn't just the students, the postdocs, the early career and experienced investigators, but it was actually those more on the user end, or those on the implementer end, those on the policy end, or even teams who were really the focus of the training. I think it was very helpful for us to not just think about the single role that we were trying to train folks up on. Because certainly at NIH, some of the time, or a lot of the time, we're thinking about what is the pathway for this person to become an independent investigator. And because of the way dissemination and implementation research really is multidisciplinary and requires that kind of team, learning about some of these models that were more of a team approach, that even asked for teams to apply to participate in the training, was incredibly useful, incredibly helpful. Just a couple more things. It was important for us to understand that the aims of the different training programs actually ranged. In some cases, they were very much focusing, as I said, around guiding the independent career in dissemination and implementation, or developing the pool of researchers. But I think what we found is there were other very, very important outcomes that were represented among the different programs that we were learning from. So one of them was very much how do we improve health? How do we improve care outcomes? How do we improve healthcare delivery? And so we're thinking about implementation science not just as advancing knowledge, but actually changing something within the environment, ideally improving individual care and system-wide care. There were other focuses around how do we support within community settings, dissemination and implementation, not just research, but actual practice. How do we do a better job of handing over those lessons to those people who ideally are struggling with how do we implement different interventions every single day? And so again, our view for having this broader synthesis is not just assuming that the end product, say, for NIH is a single R01 or multiple R01s, but rather it's outcomes that are related to advancing knowledge, but also potentially advancing practice. We were interested, similar to other things, in terms of the kinds of training outcomes that were of interest to broader research programs. And this, again, was the independent scientist. It was thinking about scholars developing into scientific leaders, not just the content of D&I, but really the movement upward of those who would be the next generation of sort of thought leaders and actual scientific leaders in the work that they do. It was important that we learned it wasn't just about the individual, but collaborative relationships and how does one foster that kind of thing. And importantly, what was more, I think, present in some of the general research training programs and less in some of our specific D&I research training programs, but very important, was increasing this knowledge of career development. So recognizing that a key aspect of training is not just the content of D&I and the methods and the measures and the questions and all that goes through it, but really recognizing where someone is within their career and what's the necessary knowledge to get them to that next step. So all of this for us was incredibly enlightening and hopefully is helpful for those of you to hear. I'm going to turn things over to Enola. She's going to talk a little bit more about some of the discussions and some of the tensions that emerged through the meeting. And as I said, then we want to turn it over to open question, answer, and discussion. So I'm advancing to the next. And Enola, you want to take it over?
Sure. Thank you, David, and hi, everybody. It's good to see so many familiar faces among those of you who are participating with us today. So in a sense, our presentation today approximates the format of our two-day working meeting. As David said, we first wanted to map the field and get a sense of what is currently going on, what is out there, and at discussion time, we'll be happy to share information and resources about some of those programs that we learned about. But during the second part of our meeting, and now during the second part of our time together today, we want to think together about some of the challenges in dissemination and implementation research with implications for training, and we would love to have your thoughts about prioritizing some of these issues. So now, in a sense, we're moving from what is to what might be or what should be as we move forward. So on this slide, we want to think a little bit about dissemination and implementation research. And as all of you who are involved in this field know, it is rapidly evolving. The issues that are current today were not maybe even on the radar a year or two ago. So clearly this requires that we train for a fast-moving science. And we think that these issues reflect some of the most cutting-edge challenges in implementation research, and tomorrow's trainees are going to have to wrestle with that, as will the training programs of the future. You know, we are learning a lot about evidence-based interventions, but we're still growing the evidence base about the implementation strategies for moving those into new settings of care. And on that issue, we really need comparative effectiveness research. What strategies work? What strategies work for what context? We know that a real frontier is figuring out how to sustain interventions over time, especially as they undergo evolving adaptation to changing context, even to new evidence that's coming on the scene. How do we scale up for population impact? How do we move beyond learning to implement in one setting to the kind of scale-up that's really required for public health reach and benefit? And then finally, as dissemination and implementation advances, we need specialists. We suspect that there will be people who specialize in work on adaptation or scale-up and spread. So while now we're talking about training for D&I, as this field evolves, we probably will soon be talking about subspecialties within dissemination and implementation research. And one specific topic that we think needs a lot of attention is really the return on investment from implementing evidence-based care. How can an evidence-based business case be made for implementing new practices? From that snapshot and all the kinds of models that we saw, there were some common tensions that cross-cut some of those, and we'd love to hear your ideas today. Certainly, what I just talked about references the evolvability of the field. In other words, a key issue and a stressor for people who organize training and for people who go to training is how do you keep up with the fast-moving knowledge base? David referenced the fact that many training programs are funded by grants, and those are time limited. So how do we sustain training programs? Our training meeting brought in a lot of key people who are involved in very related areas of research, including, for instance, health services, costing. So what are the boundaries of D&I research, and how much do D&I researchers need to know about broader health services research, for example, or comparative effectiveness research? Who should be the targeted audiences? And this, we will, I think, learn to think about that in relation to the context of training. What do people come to D&I training from, and where do they go from there? And given the rapidly growing number of programs, how do we ensure that we don't reinvent things? There is, of course, this issue of specificity. Do we reach for highly specific dissemination and implementation in a particular clinical area or a population, or as the field evolves, will skills be required that can move across those particular specific foci? And then what are the best mechanisms to use? So there's clearly a lot of variation, and I want to help us think now and invite your thinking on what would be some of the most promising ways to position our training going forward. Should we be training for the entire health field? And the tighter training program that David referenced is an example of that, as is the very exciting annual meetings on dissemination and implementation research that the NIH has convened. So especially given the emphasis on generalizability of science, which is one way D&I is a little different from quality improvement, we're looking for theories, we're looking for generalizability of some findings. So there are clearly some benefits from bringing D&I researchers together from across the entire health field. However, it's very clear that certain health conditions, certain fields, certain delivery systems have specific implementation challenges. Those of you who have worked with us in the IRI, which focuses on mental health, know that we've really dealt a lot with the properties of mental health interventions, and those have some specific implications for D&I. So one of the tensions that we face is should we be training for the entire health field and doing that together, or when and where should we be training for specific health conditions? Another issue that cross-cuts our field-based view of training is really what are the deliverables? Are we delivering dissemination and implementation content, career development accelerators, if you will? Are we giving out certificates, degrees, or should the outcome of training be the ability to get grants in dissemination and implementation research? So what are the deliverables from D&I training? Certainly the kinds of training programs that we've looked at vary in terms of their locus. Some focus on training nationally, and some focus on local institutions and training particular students. David referenced the particular program. So should a field-based view of training have both, or how should these two possible scopes of training settings be balanced? Certainly, we have a whole range of trainees. We have master's level D&I practitioners who are beginning to be trained in a handful of programs. We don't know much about those programs, but we're wondering, what are the possibilities there going forward? Certainly, the training programs have thus far been geared towards faculty entering the field of D&I, and we've heard loud and clear that many doctoral students feel like it's hard for them to get on board with D&I training. There's not, for instance, a national training that is targeted to graduate students and doctoral students and postdocs in particular. We've also seen some senior leaders in the field come into the existing training programs, often from related areas. We've had seasoned and highly experienced intervention researchers come into the D&I training programs because they want to augment, supplement, extend the work that they're doing on a particular intervention by now taking a D&I focus. We also have a lot of possibilities for what we focus on in terms of training formats. How well does group training work versus one-on-one? And we might hear from some of you some of the examples, some of the opportunities for individual training, because most of the NIH-supported training programs are one form of a group format for training. K Awards, of course, provide a means for technical assistance on particular grant projects, mentoring an individual's career development, and there are some D&I research centers, several within our CTSA programs, where technical assistance is provided for particular grants. So lots of variation, lots of possibility, and the pressing questions are, what formats should we use? What are the best uses of particular formats for particular purposes? So we have mapped a lot of variation. We've shown you the picture of what is through the snapshot that David shared. We've raised some issues now about possible ways to capitalize on that variation, to build, to focus, and we want to move toward our discussion by raising some of the implications that we think our training snapshot holds for the overall development of the D&I field. And this gets, of course, to the cross-cutting nature of the 3 meetings that NIH organized and supported this year. Training, of course, has to have some content, and methodology content is a key area of content. So we turn to the measurement and design meeting that NIH also convened this year, and are looking forward to some cross-cutting synergy so that we can infuse training programs with the latest measurement and design and reporting suggestions for D&I elements within various research projects. We also want to know what methodological resources are available that those individuals who are leading training programs can turn to. In other words, what's the information conduit route? How do we get the latest methodology developments into new and existing training programs? And then how do we train some key groups on the latest design, measurement, and reporting issues? And here we go beyond just researchers to think how important it is that reviewers, journal editors, practice and research and institutional leaders and decision makers, as well as health practitioners, how do we ensure that they are benefiting from understanding the possibilities for D&I research and well-trained individuals? Now, training is the topic of the day, but we recognize that, if you will, training sometimes takes people out of a particular context. And when they return to their local institutions, it's very important that there be some infrastructure, that there be collaboration, that there be opportunity for continued renewal, refreshing, and getting new content. So one of the things that we think needs to happen both before and after training is having a healthy local environment or a local infrastructure to support the trainee and to support the new kind of work that the individual is going to be better equipped to do. We also feel that beyond local institutions, it's really important that there be a national community of scholars. So research symposia at various research meetings. We really encourage special interest groups at health services or professional research organizations. And we think it's very important to get a D&I presence at those research meetings so that within, say, mental health services researchers or within Academy Health, within prevention research meetings, that D&I researchers have a way to come together and share their research and continue to learn from each other within those more specific fields. And then finally, everyone at our meeting noted that while it was great to come together to focus on specific topics, as we have done around 3 topics this year in these smaller meetings. There is some great cross-fertilization, some great synergy, if you will, the evidence of a field. And it's very clear that no field advances without a critical presence and without some kind of institutional home. So these opportunities to meet in local institutions and nationally in meetings and in the cross-NIH DNI meetings, we felt are very important complements to training. So to wrap up with some of our next steps, we are working on a collection of papers, as David talked about, developing framework for this field-based approach to DNI research to try to map some of the important or optimal content for the dissemination and implementation of research of the future. One paper that is being talked about is an evaluation across some of the DNI training programs, collecting training resources and finding a potential clearinghouse where curricula, course syllabi, various presentations could be housed so that the impact and the access to these training materials could be increased. And then filling some training gaps. We're really focused a lot on training researchers, but one of the gaps that was identified at our meeting was training non-researchers, including for implementation practice, and as we said, some of the influential people who serve as gatekeepers to journal articles who are leading academic institutions. So with that, we would like to open up for questions or clarification. We're happy to learn from you and take some of these ideas in greater depth.
Great. Thank you so much, Enola, and thank you, David. And we have a couple of people who've already logged in with some questions. And just as a reminder, we ask if you'd like to have your question asked over online, if you would use the Q&A function at the top of your screen just to type in your question. Or you can also press *1, and the operator will connect you directly with the speakers. So our first question is from a Russ Glasgow, I believe, who's interested in hearing more about training programs that target either or both policymakers or advanced training in DNI. And Russ, you took my softball question, so we'll square later. So would one of you like to start with that?
Sure. Nice to meet you, Russ. Good to have the question. A number of the programs that were represented at the meeting did talk, as I said, a little bit, so for that first part of the question, about not considering implementation research training to be solely the province of researchers. So as an example, there was a program that around HIV/AIDS research internationally that WHO and PEPFAR and others are involved in, where those who were applying were actually teams. And the teams included researchers, it included local administrators, and it included policymakers. Their idea of the model was that this was going to be something that would both enable evaluation and research to take place, but it had to be within the context of an initiative that was trying to advance health, improve outcomes for people with HIV/AIDS. There's another program that Knowledge Translation Canada, KT Canada, runs, where they're considering, again, different courses that are focusing, sort of practicum courses, focusing on the foundation of knowledge transfer, which is their equivalent of dissemination and implementation research, which are team-based. Again, the idea is that the team comes in around a key problem that cuts across implementation practice as well as research. And so it's the team, everything is structured around sort of problem-centered learning. And so they come in with the problem, and the idea over the few days or the different sessions of the course is that they're working through the problem and ultimately designing a project that's going to overcome that. So that's that kind of example. In terms of advanced training, beyond this webinar series that we're on, we didn't see as much that was dealing with those beyond getting that initial grounding in implementation science. So most of the trainings really were targeting people who were relatively new to the field. That said, I think we've had experience, as you know and others know, with TIDER and with the Implementation Research Institute, where it's not necessarily that those who are trainees are brand new to the field, but they've achieved some sort of interest in it, and even in some cases, they've done smaller pilot studies, but haven't yet got to the point of being full sort of large investigators. And so I think some of that, there's been that tension in terms of how much is around basic, not only basic dissemination implementation content, but sort of basic research training content, when you have some of the trainees are actually further along. In fact, we've had full professors, tenured professors, who have been a part of the course. So I think that is a tension that Enola and I have related to around how does one try to identify the optimal course that's going to both respond with the basic set of knowledge, but also deliver advanced content for those in different areas. So hopefully,
yeah, and I might comment on that a little bit also from the IRI perspective. As many of you know, the TIDER, the Training and Dissemination and Implementation Research in Health, is geared to people who, or it includes people who've not even had an externally funded grant. And we've seen, while the IRI does require evidence of an ability to secure a federally funded grant. That said, people could come into both of those training programs with a fairly comparable level of knowledge about D&I research. However, many people have first completed TIDER and then come on to IRI, and IRI, the NIMH Mental Health Implementation Research Institute, requires 2 years. So people complete 1 year and then come back, and we really see the benefit of that second year. Because by the time people come for their second year, they're familiar with the field, they've done some pilot work, they've visited and seen up close and personal and live an implementation research study in action, and they have been writing an NIH or VA research grant. So I am a big fan on the sequenced training and ensuring that the training programs provide enough time to reach some greater depth. And then finally, I consider myself, depending on the day and depending on the topic, either a novice or a little more experienced implementation researcher. And I have found the methodology-focused meetings at the NIH meeting to advance the science of D&I to be an invaluable resource to me for getting greater depth. So clearly we need to recognize the multiple levels at which people enter and are at any point in training, and if the field is going to thrive and grow, we have to be looking for greater depth and providing more specialization.
Great. Thanks, Enola. We have our next question is from Aaron Lyons, who asks, many of us have observed a growing potential for a significant and unfortunate split between, quote, implementation research, unquote, and, quote, implementation practice, close quote. How can we move forward with training approaches that avoid or account for this pitfall into which so many fields have fallen, necessitating implementation science?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Aaron, and one that we could probably spend tons of time on, and maybe we can follow up beyond this. But just briefly, I think that is actually one of the major reasons, and this echoes Russ's question before too, why some of the training programs have sought not to make it this either or, but tried to say, look, we're all focusing on a lot of the same outcomes. We're all trying to generate improvements in the uptake of interventions that seem to be beneficial. We're all interested in trying to advance sustainability. We're all interested in trying to understand the optimization of different tools that we have toward benefiting health. And it's somewhat of an artificial distinction that we sometimes throw in as to whether this is research or it's quality improvement or it's simply practice. I think, it's impossible, not because, different organizations have different very specific missions where you're told you can do this and you can't do that. And so there's always this jockeying. I mean, I think it's tied into just this notion of research and practice being these separate worlds. It doesn't suit us very well because we often assume that there's this handoff point at which something ceases to become science and is just practice. And I know I personally don't really see us ever stopping the learning. So I think the ways in which we try and massage that are how do we develop more of a learning sort of healthcare system, a learning, a learning sort of community that doesn't necessarily say that there's a starting, a middle, and an end to research and to practice, but it's this ongoing feedback loop. That's the best I think I'm going to be able to do in the minute.
Enola, do you want to add to that, or?
I think those are great comments. I think, too, giving some greater attention to the partnerships that are required for implementation research and practice. And the more that we can include practice partners in the conceiving of research questions, which really are, in fact, practice problems to be addressed, those kind of partnerships are really integral, and I think we need to emphasize those more in our training programs.
Great, thank you. Our next question from Jen Teen asks, can you comment a little on training for implementation methodologists?
So I think it's a great question. I think I think that that certainly the next webinar that's focusing on advances in research design that I think is going to be in March will more specifically focus on some of the content. I know that within the different programs that we have both been involved in and that we brought together to talk, as Enola had said, there was this constant effort to try not to be stuck with a set of methodologies that's static, but think about evolution in research design, methods, et cetera. And so I think what we ideally would like to see is some of those same mechanisms that have been used for other areas of methodologic advancement, like, there's been a number of training grants and things around biostatistics or around clinical trial methodology, we might replicate in dissemination implementation research. I think it's been hard, again, to fit expertise on all levels within an individual course that's trying to cover the landscape of D&I. I actually think that may be a gap that we should think a little bit further about, of how do we have some really senior, really talented methodologists, and is there a way that they might either spearhead training in methodology, or we might work together to figure out how to advance that more rapidly. I think right now we're trying to do a little bit of it in each of the programs, but it may be worthwhile to have a standalone thing.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think that can be an important positive outcome of the focus of the 3 D&I meetings that NIH supported this year, because a couple of them were focused squarely on methodology or methods-related issues. So I think we've talked about having some cross-fertilization across these meetings, and Jen's question is a good prompt that we need to come out of that work with some signposts for how we can ensure better training for methods in implementation research.
Great, thank you. And our next question is from Brian Leva, who asks, it seems like D&I research would be a perfect fit for DRPH programs. Has there been any effort to integrate D&I research into these programs?
So that's interesting. I'm actually not aware of, Enola may know if there are any specific examples. We have seen them integrated into PhD programs with global health as a focus. I haven't seen public health, but I would agree. There's certainly a lot of crosswalk. I think one of the things that we have been interested in just in other discussions is seeing that there's become increasing overlap between dissemination and implementation research and there's a whole entity around public health service systems research, which has a lot of people who have public health backgrounds. And so I think there's probably more scope for cross-fertilization. To answer the specific question, I don't know if there is an existing program that does that, but I think it's a natural fit. And as Enola had said, dissemination and implementation really does draw on so many different fields, and public health is clearly one of them. Enola, anything? Yeah,
I'm not aware of DRPH programs that have included this. I know that some of our IRI and TIDER alums are beginning to teach implementation research and, in particular, research methods courses for D&I within existing PhD programs. I know of a couple of social work PhD programs that are now offering courses in D&I research methods. But great direction. You know, when that happens, we'd love to hear about it, and would hope that you know, that model, if we do develop something like a portal where we can share ideas for curriculum models. We encourage any of you who are participating today who might spearhead that to share your experiences and resources that others might use.
Great. Thank you, Enola. And we appreciate all the comments and questions. And maybe we'll end with the question that when I asked Enola and David if there's a question they'd like to receive, they both said, how can I get on board with existing training programs? And I'll give both of you a time to chime in with how people can find out more and follow up about different training programs.
Yeah, Enola, do you want to start?
Sure, and I'll leave tighter to you, David, or I think Cynthia's on the line. Maybe we can share some information there. There are two training programs based at Washington University in St. Louis. One of them is the Mental Health Supported IRI. This year we are not accepting new applications. We'll be providing the second-year training for our final cohort in our first round of funding. We're hoping to be able to continue this program, and we'll say when we're able to receive new applications, you can find that information out by contacting me or looking at Washington University. We also have a new program awarded by NCI that is called MTDIRC. It stands for Mentored Training for Dissemination and Implementation Research in Cancer. It will be a summer institute based at Washington University, and I think Maggie Podak, who's the program coordinator, is on the line. We will send to all the participants today the link to that program's website, and encourage any of you who want to pursue D&I research training in the area of cancer to please send in an application.
Yeah, and so
you want to talk a little bit about TITRE and where we are with that?
Sure, and again, Cindy, I suppose I think you could do *1 if you wanted to jump in. But so at this point, there is an active planning going on around trying to get all of the logistics together for TITRE. We have full intent and interest in being able to offer that this summer, and so we're really just trying to get through some of the details to be able to move that forward, and I'm guessing that we should be able to have more information out there within the coming weeks. So that's sort of a stay tuned. The other thing that we can follow up with, in the past for each of the annual meetings, we've pulled together, in fact, Brian Mittman from the VA had kindly helped us by pulling together a list of different existing training programs. So that is something that down the road we'd be happy to refresh and send around, because that may have sort of updated information about where different things are in their scheduling.
Great. And thank you both. We'll end on that note, which I think is the to be continued note, which I think is an appropriate place for it. We'll be sending out a link at the conclusion of this call to a survey as well as an ongoing discussion on this issue at the Research to Reality Community of Practice site. And we'll continue to post training resources along that discussion thread. And just a plug for our next in our three-part series of findings and reflections from the D&I implementation workshops. In early March, we will be talking about the research design working group meeting and next steps from that meeting. And we'll be in touch with you as registration opens in February. And you'll be getting a link to an evaluation survey in just a few moments. And please take the time to respond to this, and as we continue to improve the programming that we're able to provide. So Once again, we thank our speakers, Enola and David, for being with us today, and for all of you joining us online and on the call. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
This concludes the conference call. All participants may disconnect at this time.